How many shifts does it take to afford shoes like mine? Is there anything else you need, sir? A man your age, carrying plates? You should be grateful you're even allowed in here.
Grant, that's enough.
I'm just saying what everyone's thinking. Mock me again. I dare you. Men like you don't get to dare.
The room had gone quiet long before Damon said a word. Grant Mercer had spent the evening using the waiter as entertainment, mocking his shoes, his age, the uniform he wore. He spoke with the ease of a man who had never once been made to answer for anything. Damon replied with 6 words. Grant smiled and raised his glass, certain the moment was finished. But the way Damon had set that bottle down, slow, deliberate, unhurried, was not the movement of a man backing away. So who exactly was Grant Mercer smiling at, if stories about dignity, sacrifice, and quiet strength are the kind that stay with you, hit subscribe before we go any further. This one is worth seeing through to the end. The dining room at Aster House ran on a kind of performance that most guests never noticed. The lighting was calibrated to make everyone look expensive. The silence between tables was preserved like something fragile, and the staff moved through it all with the grace of people trained to be present without being seen. Damon Price had learned that grace 3 years ago, and he had made peace with it. He was 39 years old, and he was good at his job. He knew the wine list by memory, knew which regulars preferred the table near the window, and which ones needed space from the room, knew when to speak, and when to let the food do what it was supposed to do. His manager, Reuben Hayes, had once told him he was the best front-of-house man Aster House had ever had. Damon had thanked him and gone back to work. He lived in a 2-bedroom apartment in Brooklyn with his daughter Mila, who was 10 years old and spent her evenings at the kitchen table with her homework spread across every available surface. The apartment was small, and it was theirs. After his wife passed, after the long months of treatment, and the bills that followed, and the silence that settles into a home when someone is no longer in it, Damon had needed something stable and something honest. Aster House had given him both. He was not ashamed of that. He had never been ashamed of honest work. What people sometimes forgot looking at the uniform was that Damon had not always worn one. There had been years before, Brooklyn before Aster House, before Mila needed a school with a good counselor and a father who came home at predictable hours. There had been a company called Crestline Systems, which Damon had co-founded in his early 30s, with a man who was better at raising money than Damon was, and worse at everything else. Crestline built supply chain forecasting software. It was precise, elegant work, and most of the architecture behind it had come from Damon. He had written it the way some people write music, not because anyone asked him to, but because the logic of it pleased him. Then Mila got sick. Not a minor illness, but the kind that requires a surgeon and a timeline and decisions made in hospital waiting rooms at 2 in the morning. Damon had sold his shares and his controlling interest in the technology for far less than either was worth. The deal was legal. The people on the other side of it knew exactly what they were getting, and they knew exactly why he was signing. He had saved his daughter. A few years later, Crestline was acquired by a conglomerate called Mercer Axis for a number that had several commas in it. The technology Damon built became the foundation of Mercer Axis's most profitable product line. He had read about it in a business journal while riding the subway to work. He had folded the paper, put it in his bag, and gone on with his shift. Grant Mercer arrived at Aster House on a Thursday evening with 3 people in tow. One was a junior advisor who nodded at everything Grant said. The other 2 were Helena Marlowe and a colleague from her firm, Marlowe Strategic, which was the kind of company that got called when someone needed a decision to look inevitable. Grant wanted Helena's firm to partner with Mercer Axis on the rollout of a new forecasting platform. He had booked best, table-ordered a bottle before they sat down and spent the first 20 minutes establishing the terms of the evening. Damon was assigned to the table, He recognized Grant from the ambient awareness you develop working in rooms where powerful people eat. Grant had a way of occupying space not loudly, but thoroughly, as if the air around him had been renegotiated to favor him specifically. I was 48, well-dressed, and accustomed to being the most important person in any room he entered. Helena Marlowe sat across from him, with her hands folded on the table, and the expression of someone who had attended enough of these dinners to know exactly what the next 2 hours were going to look like. Damon approached the table, introduced himself, and began reciting the evening's specials. Grant cut him off halfway through. He wanted to know what Damon would recommend from the reserve list from memory without looking at the menu. It was a test, not a question. Damon recognized the type. He named 6 wines, described their vintages and their profiles, and suggested pairings for 2 of the dishes Helena had already been considering. Grant requested a bottle that Aster House did not carry. Damon apologized and offered an equivalent with a similar structure. Grant waved it away and pointed at something else, and the exchange was over. Damon had given no ground, and Grant had no obvious complaint to make. The humiliation when it came arrived after the second glass of wine. Grant had been watching Damon move between tables, and he spoke loud enough for the entire table to hear. He asked how many shifts a man had to work before he could afford a pair of decent shoes. The words landed with the weight of something said by a person who already knows no one at the table is going to argue with him. When Damon did not react, Grant shifted angles, commenting on the uniform, on the work itself, on what it said about a man to spend his evenings carrying plates for people like them. Someone at the table laughed in the way people laugh when they want to signal they know they shouldn't. Helena Marlowe did not laugh. She looked at the table. Grant asked whether Damon's children, if he had any, were proud of what he did for a living, whether they ever came to see him at work. That was the sentence that changed the texture of the evening. Damon set the wine bottle on the table. He did not raise his voice, did not step back, did not do any of the small physical things people do when they are preparing to retreat. He looked directly at Grant Mercer and said quietly enough that it did not carry past the table the 6 words that would redefine the next several months of both their lives. Grant laughed. He looked around at the others and asked what exactly a waiter thought he could do. Damon did not reach for a threat or a raised voice. He looked at the tablet resting at the edge of the table. Grant's presentation deck was open, the summary slides for the new Mercer Axis platform, and he identified 3 specific errors in the forecasting model. Not typos. Structural errors in the underlying logic, the kind that appear when someone modifies an algorithm without understanding how the base architecture was built. He said this calmly, the way he might describe a wine's finish. He added that if the platform launched with those errors intact, the largest contract Mercer Axis was currently negotiating would fail to deliver within the first quarter. The liability exposure would follow shortly after. Grant went still. The errors Damon had named were not public information. They were a problem his technical team had spent 3 months trying to bury. Helena was looking at Damon now with a quality of attention that had nothing to do with the uniform he was wearing. Grant demanded to speak with Reuben Hayes before he left the building. He told Reuben with the calm of someone accustomed to getting what they want, that Damon was to be terminated before the next shift, and that every Mercer Axis event booking at Aster House depended on that outcome. Reuben listened. Then he said that Aster House did not terminate staff for defending themselves against a guest's verbal abuse, and that he would be happy to discuss anything else after Grant left. Reuben pulled up the restaurant's internal camera footage and saved a copy of the full recording from that table, every word in sequence, unedited. He told no one he had done it. He simply filed it somewhere he could find it again if the need arose, which, given what he had just watched unfold, he suspected it might. Helena was still at the table when Damon came to clear the glasses. She had sent her colleague ahead. She told Damon she was sorry she hadn't spoken sooner, set her personal card on the table, and placed beside it enough cash to represent more than several of his shifts combined. Damon looked at both items, then held them back out to her. He said that what she was offering could not correct what had already happened. He said something else too, that she should think about the order of events. She had stayed silent while Grant performed. She had said something after discovering that the waiter had knowledge she respected. He was not accusing her of being a bad person. He was noting that those two things had happened in a specific sequence, and that the sequence mattered. Helena took her card back. She left the cash. Damon left the cash on the table. By the following afternoon, Grant had people running a background check on Damon Price. What came back was not what he expected. Damon had been a co-founder of Crestline Systems and the primary architect of its core technology. He had sold under circumstances the buyers had understood and used accordingly. The technology had moved through acquisitions until it reached Mercer Axis, where it became the backbone of the exact platform Grant had been presenting at dinner. The man he had spent an evening publicly mocking the man he had tried to have fired that same night was the person who had originally built the thing his company's future was resting on. And that man knew exactly where the errors were. Damon, for his part, went home that night and made dinner for Mila, helped her with a school project about the city's water system, and let her stay up 30 minutes past her bedtime because the conversation was good. He had not told her anything about the evening, but he was thinking in the part of his mind that ran parallel to everything else about the choice already forming in front of him. He had spent 3 years building something quiet, a routine, a rhythm, a life that was small in the right ways. He had not pursued Crestline through lawyers or journalists or board members. He had made that calculation deliberately. But Grant was not the kind of man who left a threat alone. And the platform about to go to market was broken in ways Damon understood better than anyone currently employed at Mercer Axis. The people who would feel it first would not be Grant. They would be the companies who bought the product, the employees whose supply chains it was supposed to manage, the people who had never heard of Mercer Axis and would have no idea why things had started going wrong. Damon stood at the kitchen window after Mila fell asleep and thought about the distance between staying quiet and letting something bad happen. He was not yet sure those were the same thing. What he was sure of was that Grant had looked at him across that table and seen someone who did not matter, and that certainty more than anything else was going to be a problem for someone. Damon just hadn't decided yet whether it was going to be a problem for him or for Grant. The video appeared on a Tuesday morning, and by noon it had been picked up by 3 separate tabloid accounts, with combined followings in the millions. Whoever had filmed it had done so from a careful angle. The clip opened with Damon already standing at the table, wine bottle in hand, looking directly at Grant Mercer. It caught his voice with enough clarity to make out every word. It cut before Grant had said anything at all. What the internet saw was a black waiter in a restaurant uniform staring down a billionaire and issuing what looked without context like a threat. The caption on the first post read, "Entitled server goes off on customer at Manhattan's Aster house." By Wednesday, articles were describing Damon as volatile, as someone with a history of grievances, as a man who had injected race into a routine dining dispute. Several pieces used nearly identical language, which suggested they had been briefed from the same source. Damon read 2 of them on his phone during a break, and then put his phone away and finished his shift. The harder part came from Mila's direction. A classmate had found the video and shown it around, and by Thursday afternoon, Mila had been told by more than one person that her father was about to be arrested for threatening a billionaire. She came home quieter than usual, sat at the kitchen table without opening her backpack, and looked at Damon with the careful, measuring expression he recognized from the months after her mother died, like she was trying to figure out how much was safe to ask. She wanted to know if he had done something wrong. She didn't ask it accusingly. She asked it the way a 10-year-old asks when she already suspects the answer is complicated and she needs to hear it from the one person she trusts. Damon sat across from her and told her what had happened. He told her what Grant had said about his shoes, his uniform, whether Mila herself was proud of him. He told her he had said what he said because some things don't deserve to go unanswered, and that the people who made the video had removed the part of the story that explained his response. Mila listened and then said that didn't seem fair. Damon told her it wasn't. She seemed to accept that the way children sometimes accept hard things when the adult they love doesn't try to make it seem smaller than it is. He was less afraid of losing his job than he was of that look on her face becoming permanent. Helena reached out the following day. She met Damon near Aster house after his shift on a bench at the edge of a small plaza and told him she wanted to issue a public statement. She had been at the dinner. She could describe exactly what had taken place and make the video irrelevant within 48 hours. She also offered him a position at Marlowe Strategic Research and Systems Analysis. Better pay, structured hours, no more evenings. Managing people who treated dinner service as an opportunity for performance. Damon heard all of it and said no to both. He told her that accepting her statement would shift the story from what Grant did to Helena's relationship with both of them, and Grant's team would find a way to use that. As for the job, the fact that her first instinct was to move him somewhere better was itself a signal. It meant she still thought of his current situation as something that needed to be fixed rather than a life he had chosen. Helena said she didn't know what to do with someone who refused every available exit. Damon said that was because she was still looking for exits. He wasn't. She left that evening understanding something about him she hadn't before, and not entirely comfortable with what it meant about herself. 3 days after that conversation, during a late night at her office, while reviewing the technical documentation in the Mercer Axis investment package, Helena found something that changed the shape of everything. Buried in the file history of the platform's original architecture specifications was a set of version control signatures that had not been properly scrubbed. One of them belonged to an account registered under a name she now recognized. She pulled the records, compared them against public filings from Crestline Systems' early development period, and sat for a long time with what she was looking at. She went back to Damon and told him what she had found, then asked directly why he had never said anything publicly. Damon told her the full version, not because he owed it to her, but because she had asked the right question the right way. He described signing papers in a hospital conference room while a surgeon waited in the hallway. He said the transaction was legal, that the buyers had understood exactly what they were acquiring, and that afterward they had quietly removed his name from the platform's development history in every document that left their building. He had grounds for a legal challenge. A challenge would take years, cost money he didn't have, and require Mila to grow up inside a story about her father fighting a corporation instead of a story about her father coming home every night. He had made a choice. He was not asking for it to be undone. Helena said she wanted to use what she had found. Grant had misled investors, and the documentation was enough to create serious legal exposure for Mercer Axis. Damon told her to wait. He said if she went public, the story would become Helena Marlowe versus Grant Mercer, two people with competing financial interests and a dispute over a deal. His name would be in the middle of it as evidence, not as a person. The truth would be translated into the language that had nothing to do with him. Helena said that sounded like a reason to do nothing. Damon said there was a difference between doing nothing and waiting until the moment when speaking would actually mean something. She asked how he would know when that was. He said he would know because it wouldn't feel like strategy. She looked at him for a long time and said she was beginning to understand why he was so difficult to help. He said he'd take that as a compliment. In the days that followed, Helena also reached out quietly to a contact at the event management firm handling Mercer Axis's upcoming product launch. She said nothing about her intentions. She simply made sure she knew the layout of the venue and had someone inside who could help her with a technical request if one arose. Grant's second move came within the week. A story ran in a financial news outlet, alleging that Damon had exited Crestline Systems under suspicious circumstances, that he had liquidated his position just before a critical development phase, leaving the technical team without leadership when the company needed him most. The piece did not mention Mila. It did not mention a hospital or a surgeon, or a decision made under conditions that most of its readers would never have to face. It presented this transaction as something between opportunism and abandonment, and it included a quote from an unnamed former colleague describing Damon as someone who had always been more interested in the payout than the product. Aster House began losing reservations the same week. Corporate bookings that had stood for months were quietly canceled. Ruben told Damon that several of the restaurant's regular clients had received calls mentioning his name alongside the words liability and hostile work environment. The pressure from the ownership group was direct and worsening. Damon told Ruben he would take a leave of absence. Ruben said that was not what he was asking for. Damon said it was what the situation required, and that he didn't want the people he worked alongside to keep absorbing consequences that belonged to him. The same week, the landlord for the commercial space in Crown Heights, where Damon had been negotiating a lease, sent a brief email he had reviewed recent press coverage and decided to proceed with another tenant. 3 years of careful saving set aside across months, when Mila needed new shoes or a school trip came up unexpectedly, had just become a problem with no immediate solution. Helena called and said she could acquire the lease through a holding entity that no one would know, that it would take less than a day. Damon said no. If Grant's people were watching, and they were watching a commercial property connected to Helena Marlowe, appearing near Damon's plans, would confirm every story already written about him. He would become in print a man who had attached himself to a wealthy woman in order to recover what he'd lost. He was not going to hand them that. There was a long silence before Helena said she felt like she was watching someone drown while refusing a rope. Damon said the rope was attached to something, and he needed to know what was on the other end before he grabbed it. The reporter showed up at Mila's school on a Wednesday morning. Damon got the call from the front office while handling something at the apartment. A woman with a press credential had been waiting near the side entrance and had approached Mila directly asking about her father and what she knew about Crestline Systems, and whether Damon had ever discussed Grant Mercer at home. Mila had not answered. She had turned and walked the other way toward the street, and a car making a right turn had to brake hard to avoid her as she stepped off the curb. She was unharmed. The school had her inside. She was sitting in the counselor's office eating a granola bar and not talking very much. Damon picked her up within the hour. She sat in the back seat with her backpack on her lap and looked out the window, and he did not fill the silence. When they got home, she went to her room. He sat at the kitchen table, put his hands flat on the surface, and understood with a clarity that left no room for argument that this had moved somewhere he had not anticipated and could not accept. That evening, he pulled the restaurant plans from the top shelf of the closet. The floor layout, the draft menu, the sketches he and Mila had drawn together on a Saturday last spring. He put them in a box on the table, intending to move them somewhere out of sight, somewhere that wasn't a daily reminder of something that no longer felt like a plan. Mila came out of her room and stood in the doorway. She looked at the box, then at him, and said she thought he always told her that what other people said about you didn't get to decide who you were. She said she was pretty sure he had said that more than once. She asked why he was letting strangers who were lying decide what he was allowed to want. Damon had no answer. He sat there with his hands on top of the box and the kitchen light on, and his daughter watching him from the doorway, and he had nothing at all to say. He left the box on the kitchen table that night and sat across from it in the dark. And he thought about what Mila had said. Not the words themselves, he had heard versions of that logic before, had said versions of it to her, but the quality of being confronted with your own belief by the person you most wanted to protect from disappointment. There is a specific weight to that. It does not let you reason your way around it. He sat with it until the apartment was fully quiet, and the city outside had settled into its late-night register, and by the time he went to bed, he had already made the decision, though he would not have been able to name the exact moment it happened. In the morning, he found something tucked under the lid of the box. Mila had gotten up before him and gone through the papers until she found the first sketch, the floor plan for the restaurant, with its corner booth, and its open kitchen, and its small chalkboard near the entrance where Mila had insisted they should write the specials by hand every day, because it felt more honest than a printed menu. She had placed it on top of everything else face down. On the back, in her handwriting careful and slightly too large the way she wrote when she was trying to make something official, were 7 words, the place where Dad doesn't bow to anyone. Damon read it twice. He put it back in the box. He went and made her breakfast, and when she came out of her room, he told her the restaurant was still happening. She looked at him over her cereal bowl with an expression trying very hard not to show relief. Then she said she knew that, and the conversation moved on to other things, the way it does when the important part has already been settled. He called Helena that afternoon. She picked up on the second ring. He told her he was ready to use what she had found, with one condition that was not negotiable. She would provide the documentation, make sure the right people had access to the right room, and then step back. She would not speak for him. She would not position herself as his advocate or his source. When the moment came, the only voice making the case would be his. Helena said she understood. She confirmed that her contact at the event management firm could handle the technical arrangement they had discussed, getting Damon's device connected to the presentation system without raising questions beforehand. She also told him she had sent copies of the version control records and the original Crestline development files to 7 investor contacts that morning before 8 a.m., so that the documentation would already be in the room before anyone knew Damon was coming. Then she said she would make sure he was on the guest list and that she would stay out of his way. The venue was the kind of place designed to make money feel inevitable. High ceilings, low lighting, chairs arranged in curved rows facing a presentation stage. Grant's team had spent the morning setting up screens and running cables and arranging things to suggest that what was about to be announced had always been the natural direction of things. Grant saw Damon approximately 3 seconds after he walked in. The reaction moved across his face in a way his public composure almost, but not entirely contained. Within a minute, 2 members of the venue's security staff were moving toward Damon from the side of the room. Damon did not wait for them. He walked toward the front, where the presentation screens were still cycling through pre-show slides, and spoke loudly enough for the seated guests to hear him clearly. He said his name. He said he had been the primary architect of the technology that Mercer Axis was about to present as its own proprietary development. He said he could prove it, and that the proof was already in the hands of several people in that room. Security reached him. He held up one hand and kept talking. He was describing a technical architecture to a room full of people who understood technical architecture, doing it with the precision of someone who had built the thing himself and remembered every decision point along the way. The security staff looked at the room, which had gone very still and very attentive, and did not physically remove him, because there are rooms where that kind of action creates more of a problem than it solves. Grant stepped onto the stage. He told the room in the voice he used when he wanted to sound reasonable to an audience that what they were witnessing was a disgruntled former associate who had walked away from a legitimate business transaction years ago and had decided to make a scene rather than pursue his grievances through appropriate channels. He said Damon's record spoke for itself, that this was a man who had abandoned his own company and then spent the years since carrying plates and nursing a grudge. Damon let him finish. Then he said Grant was half right about one thing: he had sold his shares in Crestline Systems, and he had done it in a conference room at a hospital because his daughter needed surgery, and there was no other way to pay for it within the window her surgeon had given them. The people who bought those shares had known exactly why he was signing. If Grant wanted to call that abandonment, he was welcome to, but the room might want to consider what word they would use for a father who had the option of walking away from a sick child and chose not to. Grant said no one was there to hear about his personal problems. He said Damon was a waiter with a grievance, and the only reason he was standing in that room was because a wealthy woman had felt sorry for him. Damon looked at him steadily. What crossed his face was not anger and not hurt, but something more specific: the expression of a person who has waited for the right moment and has just recognized it arriving. He said he had lost a company. He had kept his daughter's life. If the choice presented itself again tomorrow, under exactly the same conditions, he would sign the same papers at the same table without hesitation, and no version of success available to him at Crestline Systems would have been worth more than the outcome he got. Then he connected his device to the presentation system. The screens filled with video, the full recording from Aster House that Reuben Hayes had preserved and handed over 2 days prior, every second of it intact and in sequence. The room watched Grant Mercer ask a man how many shifts it would take to afford shoes like his. They watched the comments about the uniform, about gratitude, about whether Damon's children were proud of him. They watched all of it, and then they watched Damon set the bottle down and say what he said. The room went silent in a way that had nothing to do with performance. Damon turned to face Grant and said the last thing he had to say. Grant could acquire companies, purchase patents, hire people to manage which version of a story reached the public first. What he could not purchase was the right to rewrite the reason a man had made the hardest decision of his life. That record belonged to Damon. It had always belonged to Damon. And as of that morning, several of the people in that room had seen enough of the underlying documentation to understand that the product Grant was about to launch had been built on a foundation that did not belong to him either. Grant Mercer stood on his own stage with no answer ready. It was the first time in Damon's experience of him that this had been true. The board of Mercer Axis moved quickly. Once the investor reaction made the cost of delay clear, Grant was suspended within 72 hours, pending an internal investigation into the platform's disclosed origins and the communications surrounding the edited video. The publications that had run pieces painting Damon as an opportunist quietly updated their coverage. Several ran the full Aster House footage without editorial framing, and the public recalibrated accordingly. The legal conversation that followed took several weeks. At the end of it, Damon accepted a royalty arrangement for the use of the architecture he had originally developed, not as a settlement or a goodwill gesture, but as the financial acknowledgement of what his contribution had actually been worth. He did not accept the board's offer of a leadership position at Mercer Axis. He told the attorneys politely that he was not interested in running something he hadn't chosen to build. He had somewhere else to be. A portion of what he received went into an account in Mila's name that she would not touch until she was older. The rest went toward a lease on a corner space in Brooklyn that had good light in the mornings and enough room for the open kitchen he and Mila had drawn into their original sketch. Price and Pine opened on a Thursday in early spring with no press event, no soft launch, and no invitation sent to anyone from the world. Damon had spent 3 years standing adjacent to. It opened because the kitchen was ready and there was no reason to wait any longer. Helena reviewed the lease terms when Damon asked her to. She caught 2 provisions that would have caused problems at renewal and suggested alternative language. She billed him at her standard rate, which he paid. That was the extent of her involvement, because that was the extent of what Damon had asked for, and she had finally learned to wait for the asking. Their relationship grew slowly from there, not because either of them was cautious by nature, but because they had both spent enough time in rooms where people performed closeness rather than building it. Helena came to the restaurant 2 or 3 evenings a week, always at the same table near the window, never with a briefcase or an agenda. On evenings when the floor was covered, Damon sat across from her, and they talked about decisions and what makes them hard, about whether there is a version of being right that costs more than it returns. They disagreed often. Neither of them managed this badly. Mila did her homework at a small table near the kitchen pass, in the noise of a working dinner service, and seemed to find it perfectly conducive to concentration. She no longer changed the subject when classmates asked what her father did. She told them he ran a restaurant, and sometimes she added that it was the kind of place where nobody had to earn the right to be treated like a person. Damon still worked some evenings on the floor himself, not to prove anything about where he'd come from, but because he was good at it, and he valued a room where the food was right, and the service was right, and the people in it felt, without being able to say exactly why, that they were somewhere made with care. There was a framed line of text in the staff area near the prep kitchen, visible to everyone who worked there. No one who walks into this room is smaller than anyone else in it. Damon had written it on a piece of paper. Mila had suggested they frame it, and so they had. Across the city, Grant Mercer's name was disappearing from the kinds of articles that had previously featured it. There are rooms where power lives and rooms where it quietly vacates, and the two are not always distinguishable from the outside until the second thing has already happened. At Price and Pine, Damon did not keep a copy of the video anywhere visible. He did not display the original Crestline documents, or the attribution records, or any of the material that had eventually confirmed what he had known about himself all along. The restaurant was not built to make a point about the past. It was built to be a place worth coming back to, somewhere that filled a room not with the noise of people performing for each other, but with something quieter and more durable. The feeling that you are among people who see you and who consider that the beginning of the whole thing, not an afterthought. Damon Price had not become a different man. He had simply found a room where the man he had always been could finally stand at full height. Some people assume dignity is something you earn through money, titles, or the right address. Damon Price knew otherwise. He carried it into every room he entered long before anyone in that room was willing to see it. If this story reminded you that how we treat people, especially people we think can't push back, says everything about who we actually are, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you want more stories about ordinary people who turned quiet strength into something extraordinary, subscribe and stay with us. We're just getting started.